like I'm watching the San Francisco 49ers or something. Oh, you guys are amazing. It's been a while since I've been up here, but I feel the Lord has given me a message for everybody here today. Isn't it just a great time to come together like this? I've seen such a growth at Lifehouse over the past few years, and not just numerically, but just in the area of family and character. And we're just moving on, aren't we? Yeah, there's nothing holding us back. That's just not the language of God where we get stunted. You know what's going to stunt your growth is if you smoke too many cigars. That's right. And I know who you are, too. I have no idea what I'm talking about this morning. Up on Luke chapter 17, I have a word for you. Luke chapter 17, and it's about the 10 leper guys. Let me read it to you. I'll be reading out of the New King James. Now it happened as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Then as he entered a certain village, there met him 10 men, who were lepers. And they stood afar off. And they lifted up their voices and said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Oh, I bet they were waving. I could imagine that they were just into it. So when he saw them, he said to them, "Go show yourself to the priest." And so it was as they went, they were cleansed. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, returned and with a loud voice glorified God and fell down on his face at his feet, giving him thanks. And he was a Samaritan. So Jesus answered and said, "Were there not 10 cleansed? But where are the 9? Were they not any found who returned to give glory to God and accept this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Arise, go your way. Your faith has made you well." Oh, I love that story. I really did. And you know what? This morning, I bet you this, that if you were a part of the Lord's entourage at that time, if you turn the clock back a couple of thousand years, and Jesus made this statement to these 10 guys to go show yourself to a priest, you probably would think back then, well, that just doesn't make sense. Why would Jesus say that? Why would Jesus say something like to these 10 guys, "Go show yourself to a priest"? If we could just set aside our Western mindsets just for a minute and think the way that people may have thought back then when Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest," because in their minds, they didn't think it would make much sense. If I could explain just for a second, the nation of Israel really hasn't existed for 500 years, at least right around 586 BC. They had consistently been conquered by their enemies. And the last enemy to conquer them was right around 63 BC by the Romans. By the time Jesus was born, the Romans had ruled for at least over 60 years. And what the Romans did is that they reduced the nation of Israel into actually 3 provinces. If you pay attention just for a second, you had Galilee to the north, and down below you had Judea. Sandwiched in between was Samaria, okay? And Galilee, up to the north, was very Jewish. And Judea, that had the temple, Jerusalem, was also very Jewish. And here in Samaria, these people were made up of several people groups. And the Jews did not like the Samaritans. They actually called them devils. There was a great deal of discrimination against the Samaritans during that time. What really enhanced the Jews is when the Samaritans decided to build their own temple up there on top of Mount Gerizim. And infuriated them because in the mind of the Jews, there is only one temple. Their anger and their fury against the Samaritans was so intense that in order for a Jew, let's say, to walk from Galilee and go to the temple in Judea, they would bypass Samaria altogether and they would walk along the borders. So for Jesus to go say to a Samaritan, Jesus wasn't that way, by the way. He didn't walk along the edges of the border because the Samaritans were a people that Jesus loved. And he went to them and he ministered to them as well. An example of that is the lady at the well, who was a Samaritan. Jesus did not follow the protocol of the typical religious person in that day, and it would offend people if Jesus was to go through Samaria because of the continual discrimination against the people that the Jews did not like. But he went there anyway. So when Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest," it may have sounded possibly a little cruel. And I'll tell you at least 3 reasons. One, there was no priest in Samaria. When he said, "Go show yourself to the priest," there was no priest in Samaria. So for these guys to go find a priest, they would probably have to go into Judea and maybe go to the temple, and it would be a distance, possibly depending on the village in Samaria, maybe anywhere from 20 to 40 miles. That's how far these guys would have to walk, so it didn't really make sense. The second reason is that for a leper, travel would be quite difficult. We don't exactly know what leprosy was 2, 3, 4,000 years ago, but some of the translations that we have today refer to it as a very serious infectious disease. There was a lot of contamination with it. Today, it's like Hansen's disease. It's where parts of your body would rot. You would leave bloodstains behind. Arthritis would set in. Your eyeball might protrude. You might lose a nose. You might lose your finger. You might even lose a foot. And so for Jesus to tell these guys, "Go show yourself to a priest," maybe walk 20 to 40 miles, wouldn't that seem kind of cruel? Because in the past, all he would do is speak the word and people were healed. The guy that was in Mark chapter 1, he just laid his hands on him and said, "Be healed." But to these guys, he had a specific word for them. So in the mind of those around him, "Jesus, why are you doing this? Why are you telling these guys in such an uncomfortable position to go walk 20, 40, 50 miles to go to the temple?" And the third reason why it just seems so ridiculous when Jesus said this is that no priest would see him anyway. No priest would want to talk to a Samaritan. That's how strict and how serious discrimination was in that day. These guys would go all the way to the temple. They wouldn't even be allowed into the precincts if they were lepers. The priest would have to come out to them and make the pronouncement. When they know that they're Gentiles, they wouldn't even want to see them. So, in a sense, it just didn't make sense. I think these guys were at a real crossroad in their life. Because they could have been like Naaman. You read about him in the Old Testament where he was a leper. And he had this idea. He was this Assyrian general. And a servant girl told him, "You know what? You can be healed of your leprosy if you go visit the prophet over there in the northern 10 tribes. Somewhere over there, somewhere in those tribes." He said, "Go to a guy by the name of Elisha who's a prophet and you're going to get healed." He took the advice of that servant girl, and he traveled all the way over to the northern 10 tribes of Israel. And there, instead of Elisha coming out with a wand that he thought was going to happen and pronounce healing over this man, instead Elisha from his house sends his servant out to Nahum and says, here's what you're to do. You're to go dip into the Jordan River 7 times. And he was incensed. He was angry when he heard that. He expected something a lot easier and a lot more glamorous and glorious, and he had this treasure to give to Elisha because of the healing. And so finally on the way back, he's not going to do that. How ridiculous that sounds. So on the way back, one of his soldiers walks up to him and just says, Naaman, what if? This is the walk of faith, you guys. It's walking with Him even when life at times just really doesn't make sense. These 10 lepers, oh, by the way, he got healed too. But these 10 guys were at a crossroad. To their mind, they were thinking, this is crazy. We have heard the reputation of Jesus, and He had healed so many people. Why would He tell us to walk all that distance when we are in such a comfortable position? But the thing is this, they decided to go the way of faith. You know the story of Jesus? He said it at least 2 times where the guys were out fishing all night. And He said to them, go throw the net on the other side of the boat. That doesn't make sense either. They might have reasoned within themselves, you know, why? It doesn't make sense. So what do? Peter especially says, Lord, we fished all night. You're telling us to throw the net on the other side? It doesn't make sense, but nevertheless, at your word, we'll go ahead and throw the net on the other side of the boat. You know what? And you know what happened? They had scores of fish, and the nets began to break. You know, they actually counted up 153 feet for accuracy. They kept really good records in those days. They walked around with Apple computers. You know, you may have heard my testimony a few times, and I share it very little. But I was born with a learning disability. And it really caused me to struggle throughout my childhood, and especially when I was going to school. Normally, when a person has my kind of disability, had to do with the processing of information, bits and pieces of dyslexia, you know, these type of things. It also affects your personality sociably. And I can remember when I was in the 12th grade, it was just weeks before graduation, my counselor called me into the school office and he said, Jerry, you're not going to be able to graduate because you don't have enough credits. Gratefully, I had a teacher who was sympathetic with me, and she gave me credit for classes that I didn't even take so that I would be able to graduate. In life, I was the youngest of 5 kids, and I just wanted to be, I just wanted to please my parents. I wanted to prove myself over and over because I wanted their recognition. I wanted to be proud because my 4 siblings, older siblings, are very successful in life. But I wasn't that way. I struggled throughout my childhood. A couple of years ago, I was with my sister, and she explained to me again some of the things my mom's, particularly my mom, had to go through because of my learning disabilities. Well, I was able to graduate because of this teacher. Actually, I graduated on the 3rd baseline of Angel Stadium down in Anaheim. So in order to please my parents, and I really did want to be successful in life, I went to college, Fullerton Junior College, and I flunked out of that after 6 weeks. Matter of fact, I got all F's on my transcript. One thing about me, I've always been a fighter, but I would always fight the wrong way. So I went back to college because I didn't want to give up. This time I went to another college, I flunked out of that. And I didn't tell my parents about what happened. My brother-in-law came to me, and he knew what was going on, and he gave me one of those motivational speeches. You've heard it before. If you set your mind to something, you can accomplish anything. Have you ever heard that before? Well, that didn't work with me. So I just hit rock bottom, and I flunked out of a trade school. I wasn't sure what to do, so I thought, maybe my parents would be proud of me. They never said they were this proud of me. It's just something that I held on psychologically for all these years. I didn't have a lot of friends. I wasn't the most popular kid in school or anything like that. So I went to the Navy recruiter, took the entrance exam, and I can remember he called me into his office. And he said to me, "Son, I got bad news for you. The Navy doesn't want to take you because they consider you to be borderline mentally retarded." And so I retook the test, did a little bit better. This time the Army accepted me. And I was stationed in Germany at the tail end of the Vietnam War. And I had been there for I don't know how many months, but I was up for advancement to go from an E3 to an E4 and get what they call the Specialist Fourth Class. I was one of 20 candidates, and we would stand before a board one at a time, 20 of us. And they told us that our results would be posted the next morning on the bulletin board, or whatever they call it back then. 19 names appeared on that board. There was one name that did not appear, and you can guess who it was. I mean, when you meet failure after failure after failure, you begin to think of yourself as insignificant and a loser, and you'll never accomplish anything in life. No motivational speech, no great sermon, anything like that, or even encouragement is going to encourage you what is so ingrained and embedded into your psychological makeup unless the Holy Spirit is behind it. And so what happened a few months later, the best thing in my life happened, is I met Jesus. And everything was about ready to change. I turned to him, and I thought, this isn't going to work either. And I'd complain, and I would go into my doubt. It's not going to work, but it did. And it came with supernatural encounters that I don't have time to share with you, but they were quite supernatural. One time, I went into the chaplain's office, and he was a spirit-filled man. His name was Chaplain Joseph Tumpkin. He just recently died last January, and it just broke my heart. I went to see him about something, and all he did was lay his hands on me to pray. What I can remember is this. It was like something I can't... Have you ever had somebody dump a can of paint on your head? Maybe your wife? It's hard to explain when you never felt it before, but something came over my head. At the same time, my hand shot up in the air, moving like this, speaking in other tongues. And in the midst of all of that, out of control, I heard the Lord say, "I want you to preach." That to me was surprising. I felt honored. But in a sense, it didn't make sense. Why me? Like the lepers, when Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest," it doesn't make sense. Oftentimes, the Lord has us do things that just does not make sense. We face disappointment. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. But for those lepers, they decided to walk the walk of faith. For me, it didn't make sense anyway. But during this time, the Lord never allowed me to use my learning disability as an excuse to walk forward and to walk by faith. That's why we walk by faith. If we walk by sight, then things would make sense. We walk by faith so much because in life, oftentimes things do not make sense. Why would God want me, this born loser, all his life, social disabilities. Why me, Lord? Now I realized that I would have to face my greatest obstacle, you might say my Goliath. I love to read the Bible. I didn't understand it. I read through Leviticus one time, and somebody asked me what I read, and I said, I have no idea. I do know this one thing. It must have been really difficult back then. I read in the book of Revelation. I had no idea what I read there except this one thing. In the end, we win. You know what I mean? There's so much. With the learning disability, it was like, I don't know. I was driven to the Word. I was driven to His Bible. And when I ETS or separated from the Army, I realized I'm going to have to face my greatest obstacle. Oh, I complained all the way. God never listened to me. It was like heaven was like brass. He wouldn't allow me to make those excuses, Lord. He hates two words in our vocabulary. I can't. When He says you can and you're going to face impossible odds, don't say I can't. If God is in it, He can help you. He can walk through. He's not the kind to take a wand over our life and make life simple for us. Sometimes life is difficult, but in that difficulty, don't ever say, I can't. I had to go back to school. And there was a school nearby. It was a Christian school called SCC, or Southern California College. Today it's called Vanguard University. It's one of our Assembly of God colleges. And I remember the school didn't really care about my bad transcripts. They just wanted my money. After about 2 or 3 weeks going to school, I can remember I had 14 units. I was flunking. I was so despondent, like, here we go again, Lord. You've called me, you want me to go into the ministry, you want me to preach, and here I am. Life doesn't make sense. I'm here for 2 or 3 weeks, and now I'm starting to flunk again and be that disappointment to my parents. I don't know what happened. God never healed me. I'm still not healed. But something kicked in, and all of a sudden I just started to excel. Never experienced that before in my entire life, getting A's and B's. Are you kidding me? My life was wrecked with C's, D's, and F's. Somewhere in the middle of that semester, the Lord spoke to me and said, not only are you going to graduate from college, but you're going to go on to graduate school and get a master's as well. It took a long time. In the meantime, I met Nancy, and I used to tell Nancy, after I get my master's degree, God's going to open up the doors for us so that I can, this is my dream, it was to teach at the Continental Bible College in Brussels, Belgium. That was my dream. My graduate school was actually Liberty University. I had to be on campus a couple of times over in Virginia. But I didn't walk the graduating line. After I graduated, the pastors here at the time, and Nancy, got the diploma and they presented it to me. That was my graduation, right here at the church. And everybody applauded because they knew how hard I had worked to get this diploma. And during the midst of that applause, I heard the Lord say, now that I have given this to you, I want you to give it back to me. I didn't know what that meant, except this. I graduated. Now I'm ready to have those doors open up so Nancy and I can move our family over to Brussels, Belgium, and life is going to be sweet. It's not the way it happened. Those doors were closed. And you might say I was actually bitter. I became bitter towards God because life did not make sense. Nancy and I had a very successful cleaning business at the time. And maybe on a Sunday morning, I could preach to a full church. Monday night, I'd be dumping garbage and cleaning toilets. And probably during a 5-year period, I was just so upset. I tried to reason within myself, Lord, you've done so much for me in the past. I actually heard God's audible voice one time. I experienced so much, I had to in order for God to move me forward in the path that He wanted me to take. It was not an easy path, but I just couldn't get over the fact that after getting this degree and having promises of God, how come the doors did not open up to Brussels, Belgium? I'd tell God that. Every time I was cleaning a toilet, I'd say, God, why would I go and get a master's degree and here I am doing something like this? And by the way, there's nothing wrong with manual labor, okay? I want to get that out. But for me, it didn't make sense. I really had a hard time, and I felt like my dreams, I heard all the sermons, and they sounded really well. You know, God will go ahead and fulfill your dreams, but maybe my dreams was a little off course. I felt like they had been dashed and smashed to pieces. My path was not an easy one. And maybe here this morning, your path that you find is not necessarily an easy one. But I tell you what, the path that you choose that's independent from God is going to be a lot harder than the path that the Lord chooses for you. But it may not be that easy. One of my favorite verses that I leaned on was Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6, where he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not according to your own understandings. In all thy ways acknowledge Him. And what's the promise? And He shall direct your path. There's an old saying that if the Lord closes one door, He'll open up another. You know what? It's true. God had a plan. By the way, God has a plan for all of us, but that doesn't mean that He's obligated to explain it to you. God had a plan for Abraham. This is what really got me. All Abraham wanted in life, he wanted a son. But God had a greater plan for Abraham. He gave him a nation. He gave him millions and millions of souls, like the sands of the sea or the stars of the sky. I had asked for one nation. I wanted Belgium. And instead, what God did is He took this loser and has sent me to over 70 nations around the world. I had no idea what He was doing. You know where my heart is? It's among the poor. I love to go to some of the most neglected countries of the world. Frank has got a team going, I understand, to the Dominican Republic. If you are going, great. If you're praying about it, may I encourage you to stop praying about it and just go. Go to the meeting, listen to what they're going to say. I think every believer at one time in their life should go and experience a culture that is totally perpendicular to what they've ever been used to. Learn about people and their culture. Learn how blessed that we are, that we don't have to complain about potholes in the street or somebody taking your seat in church or your parking place out in the park and the spaces out there. We complain oftentimes that the steak that you ordered isn't cooked to perfection. Go to a foreign culture, a third world nation like Frank is going to, and I guarantee you it just changes the way we think. And it also changes us from the inside out. The greatest, I think, joy I've had is taking teams with me around the world. Some of you have been part of my entourage. I had no idea. Why would God choose somebody like me? Why not somebody that's a good speaker? Somebody that socially is incredibly. They have all kinds of friends. Why take somebody that's hard at reading or somebody that just doesn't really get it? Why would God do something like that? Maybe it's because it says in His scriptures that God is no respecter of persons. He chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. You know, God is just, to this day it blows me. I've had a number of students ask me and say, Jerry, what was probably your greatest experience? I used to say, well, you know what, it's probably the last trip. But one of the trips that I took was, I'd been to some of these countries many, many times. It's not just 70 countries, but 70 countries repeated over a number of times. How many times I've done this, I really had lost track, at least 60 trips overseas. One of my favorite countries was actually Pakistan. And I remember on our last trip there, we were in a place called Peshawar. At that time, it was one of the 10 most dangerous cities of the world. This is the hometown of Osama bin Laden, and we were called to go there. I can remember the phone call that we got with an invitation, and some of the pastors that we were with refused to accompany us because it was so dangerous. We were not allowed to go into an open air stadium like we had been before, into soccer fields, or what we call them cricket fields back then. Hundreds of thousands of people would come out. I wasn't the main speaker, but I was part of a team that would draw thousands and thousands and thousands of people, up to 200,000 people at one time. When we went into that auditorium, we flooded it out about 2,000 people. We had all kinds of people in there, you know. Afterwards, I remember we had a Peace and Harmony conference. It was initiated by the Muslims. Most of them were Sunni. There were Shiite there. They came from India, Afghanistan, all over Pakistan, at least 100 of them, to see what us Americans had to say about this Jesus. And they crowded into this building. And I remember that the top speaker shared that you can't have peace with the Prince of Peace. I sat there, being an observer, enjoying every minute of it. And then the head Muslim cleric, all of Pakistan, big long beard, looked at me sitting there, and he said, would you please come up with an interpreter? If I had prepared that message, I probably would have peed in my pants. I was completely taken off guard. I can't believe I'm about ready to do this. And I stood there. I looked at these guys, and I began to share with them all about Jesus. Jesus' love. I can't remember what I shared, but mingled into that audience were members of the militant group Taliban. You've heard about them. This lasted for maybe 10 minutes. Afterwards, I went back into my hotel room, and I just sat there. I sat there because I could not believe this is something that Benny Hinn would do, something that Bill Johnson might do, or one of the big shots in the charismatic Christianity, and I could not believe what had just taken place. God, you sent me around the world to minister to some of the most hardened militants. And these guys weren't there to do us any wrong. They were there because they wanted to know about Jesus. We ate with these people. We sat down and had the worst curry I ever had in my life. You know? Sometime later, why I'm sharing this, I do not like to talk about myself. Nancy will tell you that. I oftentimes hesitate because it seems like I'm bragging or trying to bring attention to myself instead of what the Lord does. I even read this morning that whom commends himself is nothing, but it's whom the Lord commendeth. I'm mindful of that when I came here this morning, because it's all about Jesus this morning and what he does. About 5 years ago, and I have a lot of stories. If you read the preface of the book, I had a couple stay till almost midnight. Usually for us older folks, 9 o'clock is the limit when you come over for dinner. You come at 6, you leave at 9 because that is respectful, but younger people don't get it. They don't understand the limitations that us older folks put on people. And so it went to 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and we're looking at our watch, and they're not getting any idea what we're trying to do. Finally, at 11:30, I became impatient, went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, and this guy followed me, and he said, Jerry, could you just teach me or tell me one more story? It affected me. Nancy would say, Jerry, write a book. See? It was like a wall. I can't do that. Remember, God don't like that word, I can't. 5 years, she would say, write a book. I'd come home from the mission field, and I'd tell her what had happened, and she would say, write a book. Finally, in a group setting, I shared a story or two, and she shouted at me, and she said, Jerry, write a book. When she gets mad, I enjoy it. But I still wouldn't listen. I can't write. I'm not good in my English. I'm not even a good preacher. I'm thinking all these things. Who is going to want to listen to my stories anyway? I don't want to do this. I don't know how to do that, And then finally other people began to say, Jerry, write a book. And I realized something. After all, not just Denise, it was a lot of people. Of all those people and all that I had been through, I was saying the very thing that I encourage people to do. I've encouraged people to step out and do the impossible, and here I am unconsciously saying, I can't do that. So I decided, well, I'll go ahead and give it a shot. I had some really good counsel. I went to people that had written books before me, and I just started to write. And I'd share everything with Nancy, and she was my biggest critic. And I'd say, hey, Nancy, let me read this to you. I don't like that. Don't share that. And then I come back later, and she said, did you write about the kittens? I go, I don't want to write about those kittens. She said, put it in the book like that. Because that is what people connect with. It's the trivial things, not just the great things, but it's the trivial and the humor. So I included that in the book. She became my greatest critic. At that time, Hilda had retired, the Spanish teacher, Hilda, in the back. And she became my editor-in-chief. And my critic. The purpose of the book is not to write about my adventures. The purpose of the book is actually to share, like Moses at the burning bush, where God is able to take something so insignificant, ignite it, and turn it into a miracle. That's you. It's all of us here this morning. Oh, I have story after story after story after story after story I could share. Some of them are incredibly trivial. Some of them are just amazing. But that's not the purpose. It's to show what God can do to a born loser, because born losers are bound to win when we find Jesus. I still sit back, seriously. And sometimes Nancy and I are going to have a devotion together, and I can't stop. I can't do it. I just get into this, Lord, thank you. You just thank Him over and over and over, because honestly, what can we offer Him? He's done so much for us. Really, what can we offer Him except our worship and our thanksgiving? James says this, draw nigh to God, and He'll draw nigh to you. The things about these 10 lepers, they weren't passive. When the Lord told them to take a journey that didn't make sense, they didn't stay. They didn't say, okay, Lord, here I am. It doesn't work like that. James says, draw nigh to God, And God's response will be, He will draw nigh to you. And I encourage you here this morning, this seems to have been my life's message for a long time. Search the Scriptures. Make it your habit. Make your devotion. Find God and what He thinks about you in the Scriptures. When you take your daily walk or whatever you do, include the Lord in your prayer life. Find that place where you feel really good and just tell God how amazing Him is. And bring your complaint or whatever it is to the Lord, because really, He's not going to be surprised by what you have to say anyway. He loves you. And He cares. You know, Scripture says, cast all your cares upon Him because He cares for you. And also start to dream again. Find Him. Dream again. Don't let those dreams be sift from your very life, because God is awesome in this place. Lord, I thank You this morning for all my friends that are here. And I pray, Lord, that it's not about me. It's not about me, but I pray, Lord, that people would rise up once again that have been discouraged. All of us here today would bond together and believe, Lord, that we are not insignificant. That You're able to take a bush, which is prophetic of Moses' life, who thought he was insignificant, and You can ignite it and turn it into a miracle. And Lord, we don't want to be passive. These priests went on these lepers went on a journey that didn't make sense, and somewhere in that journey, they were healed. One guy grew back a foot. Another guy got a nose. Another guy grew his ear. But we're grateful, Lord, for the one who came back to give You thanks, because he had his priorities down. And we pray here in this day that our priority is focused and centered on You here today. I did my best to let people know that You're not a mean God. Oftentimes life doesn't seem fair or seem right. But when our hearts and our devotion is turned towards You, things just fall into place. Maybe not when we want it to, but Lord, You are so amazing, because You have a word for us that I'll never leave You nor forsake You. Quoted more than any other passage, whether it be in the Old or the New Testament, You would never leave us nor forsake us. I pray today, Lord, that each person is encouraged and feel a little bit taller than when they first walked in. We have been invited, church, we have been invited into a supernatural lifestyle. It's supernatural. Because when the Lord draws nigh to us, it becomes a supernatural lifestyle. God bless you, and thank you for coming this morning. And I hope that you get a copy. I'm not selling them. I want to give them out, but I am welcoming a donation because it is expensive. Okay. Thank you so much, and God bless you. Okay, get out of here.